Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Doyle Hodges, the executive editor of TNSR, and in this edition of Horns of a Dilemma, we're joined by two roundtable contributors from our recent roundtable on the question of nuclear first use and sole nuclear command and control authority. Dr. John Harvey and Mr. John Wolfstall take opposite positions in examining the question of whether the United States ought to adopt a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. If you're interested in reading their remarks in more detail, along with the contributions of Professor Nina Tannenwald, Professor Rachel Whitlark, and Professor Brendan Green, you can find the roundtable online at tnsr.org.
Hi, this is John Harvey. I am a physicist. I started out my career in elementary particle physics. I decided I wanted to make a more practical contribution to science and technology in the area of national security. So I went to Lawrence Livermore Lab for the first part of my career. I spent time at the Stanford University Center for International Security and Arms Control, where I came under the mentorship of Bill Perry and John Lewis and Sid Drell and others. I subsequently went to Washington to work in the Department of Defense and then the Department of Energy. And I concluded my career with another tour at the Department of Defense, where I retired in 2013 as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs.
And our second guest, Mr. John Wolfstall.
Hi, my name is John Wolfstall. I'm currently the director of the Nuclear Crisis Group and a senior advisor to Global Zero, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons. Prior to that, I was the senior director for arms control and nonproliferation at the National Security Council until January of 2017. I was also special assistant to President Barack Obama and have been working on nuclear issues for 30 plus years, including 5 years as a civil servant in the U.S. Department of Energy, where I worked on the ground in North Korea and in Russia, working on nuclear security and nonproliferation programs, and have worked both at the Carnegie Endowment, the Arms Control Association, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington.
Great. And if I can ask you to go ahead and summarize for us the argument that you made in your roundtable contribution as to why you believe that the U.S. should adopt a no first use policy.
I've been working on nuclear policy for the better part of 3 decades, and it's become increasingly clear over most of my career that nuclear weapons are far more dangerous and far more risky than most people appreciate. We tend to minimize the risks of managing and possessing these weapons, and we tend to overstate their benefits. And in an environment where we are facing arguably the greatest risk of nuclear use in any time since the beginning of the Cold War, it seems to me that we should take any available and responsible policies to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons will be used against us and our allies. The most effective way to do that, arguably, is to have the United States adopt both a no first use policy, to adopt changes to our nuclear force structure that back up that stance, and then to push and encourage other countries to follow suit, including building on the existing no first use policies in India and China. In a nutshell, adopting no first use would make the United States and its allies safer and less vulnerable to the risk of accidental nuclear use or nuclear use through miscalculation or escalation. Then after that, you have to look at the landscape that suggests, to my logic, that the threat to use nuclear weapons first by the United States is simply not credible. Our allies don't believe that we will, and many of our allies don't believe that we should use nuclear weapons first because they recognize it would only invite nuclear retaliation against them and us. And it's also not necessary because the United States remains the world's conventional superpower. We are fully capable of addressing any non-nuclear threat coming from non-nuclear weapon states and from nuclear weapon states. The only credible use of nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons against the United States or our allies. In that case, it would be both credible and probably necessary for the United States to consider retaliating with nuclear weapons. But without that threat, without the initiation of a nuclear conflict by Russia, by China, by some other state, it simply is not necessary or credible for the United States to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And by keeping open the argument that we can and will use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, we actually lower the nuclear threshold. and make it easier for countries like Russia or North Korea, who do also open out the prospect of using nuclear weapons first, to maintain that policy. Instead, we should make it much harder for states to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons, because that plays to our conventional military advantage, something that we should look to highlight, not undermine.
Great, thanks. And we'll turn over next to Dr. John Harvey.
Thank you, Doyle and John. First, I want to say that my colleagues, Nina Tannenwald, who has written on the no first use issue, and John Westall, have been friends for many, many, many years. I've known John since the early days when he was a lot younger than he is now, although he looks quite young now, what you see him. And Nina Tannenwald was at our wedding, and the kind of wedding I would have, you could best characterize her as the matron of honor. So it's a little bit odd for me to be sitting here sort of disagreeing with my friends, but let me start off with the following. We have, over the past 20 or 30 years, had several reviews of what is the principal topic, which is whether the U.S. should adopt a no first use policy regarding nuclear weapons. We have weighed the risks and benefits to both the nuclear deterrence posture and its non-proliferation policy goals of the United States in renouncing the first use of nuclear weapons. President Obama, in his 2010 nuclear posture review, considered a no first use policy and rejected it. At the end of his term, he considered again the possibility of a no first use policy, and again, on the advice of his senior advisors, rejected it. Mr. Trump, in his 2018 nuclear posture review, reaffirmed Mr. Obama's decision not to pursue a no first use policy for the United States. One of the things more recently, Senator Warren, who has been running for president, and Adam Smith, who is the new chair of the House Armed Services Committee, have called for a U.S. no first use policy. And indeed, well-meaning supporters of no first use are taken with the simplicity of this basic idea and its potential for bolstering what some would call U.S. moral leadership in the world. After all, they argue, the U.S. has no intention of starting a nuclear war, so why not just say so? Given the recent revival of this topic, it's appropriate to review, as we did in our policy roundtable. In this regard, there are three main risks to adopting a declaratory policy of no first use. The first is our concern that it could weaken deterrence of adversaries in specific cases. It could make them not fear a possible reprisal from a catastrophic attack on the U.S. or its allies. If America adopts no first use, allies could lose confidence in the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent. And the third risk is to the goal of non-proliferation. Lost confidence among our allies could spur them to develop and field their own nuclear weapons. And this is not a goal consistent with U.S. non-proliferation policy. The purported benefits of adopting no first use, which I have discussed in the paper, in the roundtable, are simply insufficient to offset these three inherent risks. And let me stop there.
John, let me just ask you, because, having been the president's senior advisor for nuclear policy from 2014 till the end of his administration, if you know something I don't, I'd be both concerned but surprised. I'm not aware that President Obama rejected the idea of no first use. In the memos that we wrote, we presented the idea of pursuing no first use as a policy option. He expressed interest in delving into more detail. And at that point, the idea that we were considering no first use was leaked, presumably by opponents of the policy. And at that point, the review was halted. So I think it's not fair, in my understanding, to say that the president rejected it. But do you have a different understanding?
I have an understanding that it was on the table for this, what we call the mini NPR, at the tail end of Mr. Obama's second term. It was on the table, it was discussed, it was debated, but it was never adopted. Do you think the term rejected is too strong? How about saying it was not adopted?
I mean, I think it's fair to say the president chose not to pursue it, but I don't think it's fair to say that he weighed the issue and decided that it wasn't worth pursuing. I think there were a number of other political, diplomatic, and quite frankly, process problems that prevented him. And quite frankly, it was towards the end of the administration, I think he recognized adopting such a major change rapidly at the end of his administration was probably not sustainable. But I think it's an overstatement to say he rejected it, because quite frankly, I think there was a lot of interest among his advisors in terms of what adopting no first use might mean and how it might actually reduce the risk of nuclear war. But it's true, there were opponents, particularly from the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs, that created a debate. But I think rejection is an overstatement.
I would say that it was Mr. Obama's policy since the start of his first term to reduce the role and relevance of U.S. nuclear weapons in U.S. national security. And I think that's been a role that was also adopted by his predecessors, including Clinton and George W. Bush. And he also sought to reduce to a minimum the likelihood that the U.S. would have to ever use nuclear weapons in the context of something other than deterring or responding to nuclear attack. But in both cases, both in the early part of his term and the latter part of the term, he was not able to come to the conclusion that it would be in the U.S. national security interests to take off the table any potential role of U.S. nuclear weapons in deterring something other than nuclear attack.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we could argue, sort of around the maypole whether that was for national security considerations or other considerations. But it is worth pointing out that in the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010, President Obama said that while the conditions didn't yet exist to adopt a sole purpose declaration where the only role for nuclear weapons was to deter nuclear attack, he sought to create those conditions. And I think it's important that Vice President Biden, in his last foreign policy address in January 2017, said he and the president had determined that there was really no circumstance where the United States would need to use nuclear weapons first. And as far as he was concerned, sole purpose was both appropriate and valid. And he's echoed that now on the campaign trail.
So if I may, it seems like one of the areas of disagreement between you is on the efficacy of conventional deterrence. And you assert in your essay that there is no conventional threat that the United States could not expect to prevail in a protracted conventional conflict versus either China or Russia. And as I read that, it struck me that the word protracted was important here, because part of the concern is as to whether those conflicts would ever get the opportunity to be protracted. And so I think, when I take a look at Dr. Harvey's three primary points in your considerations, this disagreement on the efficacy of conventional deterrence seems to be at the heart of it. I was wondering if you'd expand, and Dr. Harvey, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. And I think it is a critical question. I've tried to unpack this a bit in my piece on Texas National Security Review. The scenario that a lot of people point to is the possibility of a conventional war breaking out in the Baltics, where Russia interferes or actually occupies Estonian, Lithuanian, Latvian territory. NATO invokes Article 5. We begin to muster the capabilities to block and eventually repel those forces. And there's a massive shooting war that's going on. The Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff will tell you that we will prevail in that conflict. It's not going to be quick because Russia has geographic advantages. They're close to the fight. We're far from the fight. And Russia knows this. It's one of the reasons that they threaten to use nuclear weapons against anybody should they begin to lose conventional conflict that eventually threatens the Russian state. So they know that we would be able to reinforce through German ports, French ports, however, and bring forces to bear to eventually prevail in the conflict. And I don't think that is disputed. That's obviously a horrific circumstance that we don't want to see play out. The question is, what is gained by the United States saying, in that scenario, we would potentially use nuclear weapons first? And you have to look at the actual practicalities of it. What targets are we going to use these nuclear weapons on? We have three choices. We can either use nuclear weapons on Russian forces on NATO territory, not something that the Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians are going to endorse. And so that's a non-starter. We could strike either Kaliningrad or Russian territory, but that's a massive escalation. And the Russians have said clearly that a nuclear attack on their territory would bring about a devastating response. I believe them, as any sane person should, and that means we're basically starting a nuclear war. when we don't have to because we're going to win the conventional conflict anyway. The third possibility is that we demonstrate our resolve by using nuclear weapons on a Russian-allied non-combatant that might be supporting the fight. Maybe we nuke Belarus or some other. That's also nonsensical, and it's counter to U.S. policy because we have said we will not use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapons state that's in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations, including Belarus. So what is the target for this nuclear weapon? It's why I get to the question of credibility. Our conventional deterrents, our conventional capabilities are credible. We can use those to protect our allies and to defend our interests. The idea that we're going to start a full-out nuclear war when we don't have to, in my mind, simply isn't credible and doesn't aid either conventional deterrence or the balance of forces.
So, Dr. Harvey, you argue that our nuclear force posture is critical to our deterrence posture. How would you answer Mr. Wolfstall's claims there?
Let me step back and give a little perspective to what Nina Tannenwald calls extended conventional deterrence as a goal. Back in the 50s, when the Russians had massive conventional superiority on the NATO front, we explicitly said we would use nuclear weapons first to respond to this massive conventional capability. And indeed, we put our money where our mouth was by deploying thousands of tactical nuclear weapons ranging from air defense systems to shorter range missiles to actually atomic demolition munitions or landmines. This was a period of time where there was quite a bit of risk. We didn't have the ability to confront with conventional forces the massive Russian conventional superiority on the front. And so we use nuclear weapons as a mechanism to manage the potential for conventional conflict. With the end of the Cold War, back in the George Herbert Walker Bush, removed most of the non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. So that today only a few hundred remain as part of our commitment to NATO's defense and deterrence. When we look at the conventional situation, it was pretty bad for Russia back in the days shortly following the end of the Cold War. Today, they're on their way back. It would be very difficult for us to repel an initial Russian assault into one of the Baltic countries today. It would take us several months to get the forces in the field and ramped up for us to be able to carry out the conventional operations. In the meantime, a country such as Lithuania, first of all, is overcome by the initial Russian assault. And number two, is going to go through a hell of a time with enormous damage to its people and its infrastructure in the fight, in the NATO fight to retake and kick the Russians out. I mean, the Lithuanians don't want to take anything off the table with respect to deterring Russia. And by saying we would not respond with nuclear weapons, we are taking something off the table. And not only Lithuania, but other countries in that realm, as well as in Asia, have expressed very similar perspectives on this.
So, John, you're absolutely right that the countries that we talk to, particularly when we have Defense Department to Defense Department consultations, they say, look, we don't want you to take anything off the table because we don't want to in any way suggest that we are going to weaken our defense and our deterrence against Russia.
We don't want to make NATO, we don't want to make the world safe for conventional conflict either.
But there's no evidence that the U.S. threat to use nuclear weapons actually deters Russian conventional attack. You know, you can spin all sorts of possibilities that, gee, why did Russia act here and didn't act there? But the Russians don't view our first use as credible. They basically write it off. The fact that they're willing to threaten first use themselves suggests that they understand that there are serious constraints on the willingness of the United States to use nuclear weapons. It's one of the reasons that the Trump administration, wrongly in my view, thinks we need more low-yield nuclear weapons. But to my mind, I think what's necessary is for the United States to reassert the political and conventional commitment to these allies, not use this shiny object crutch of nuclear weapons, which in my mind aren't credible. Nothing's going to happen with our allies by the U.S. just saying, okay, we're going to make this change. It's part of a consultation that you have to work with our allies on. But look at it this way. We still have about 4,000 nuclear weapons. The Trump administration wants to build more, but I don't see our allies more reassured today than they were a couple of years ago. I see them less reassured because the political support for the alliances isn't there. And to my mind, that's what's really missing from this debate is how do we make the alliances more credible? In my view, it's not through increasing our reliance on nuclear weapons. It's by reducing our reliance on nuclear first use, reducing the force structure that supports that, and spending the money on real conventional improvements that enhance our ability to deter and defeat conventional attack.
On one of your last points, which is the damage that has been done to the confidence in our allies, I think there has been some damage done in this administration, which is regrettable and which I share your concern. But I want to get to another point, and John referred to this at the end of his statement just now, about what both John and Nina are proposing. And what they're proposing is much more than what traditionalists would think of as referring to a no first use policy. I mean, when we think about no first use initially, it's a declaratory policy. It's a policy that says you won't do something under certain circumstances. That's all it is. In fact, both John and Nina refers to it as it's cheap talk. And what they're arguing is not just a declaratory policy on no first use, but what they're arguing is that they propose a major operational and structural change in U.S. forces, which would go well beyond no first use. They're talking about the possibility of de-alerting or demating the ICBM force, which we have also had debates upon, numerous debates upon, and one in which I had in the Clinton administration and rejected this de-alerting or demating because it has huge implications for strategic stability and deterrence. We have fought over this before. They refer to the possibility of smaller, less threatening forces. In fact, Tana Wall argues that we need to shape the physical quality, and I'm quoting her, shape the physical qualities of nuclear forces in a way that renders them unsuitable for missions other than deterrence of nuclear attack. I will make the argument that is simply an impossible thing to do, unless you take all of your nuclear weapons, remove them from delivery systems, and put them in storage bunkers, okay? And even then, you can always bring them back. The point is that compared to a simple no first use declaratory policy, what Nina Tannenwald and John Wolfstar are proposing is what I would call a much more comprehensive restructuring of both the operations and of U.S. forces, which is not traditionally considered as part of no first use.
It's fair to say both my argument and those of others who support both no first use and significant steps to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons will be used, either through escalation or through miscalculation, believe that the current force structure, which John and others fully support, for understandable reasons, we've had it for a long time. It was built during the Cold War, and they believe, rightly or wrongly, that it prevented full-scale nuclear war from happening, has tremendous risk baked into the system. We have multiple examples, relatively speaking, or not relatively speaking, but objectively speaking, every couple of years we have a significant incident in which either U.S. nuclear weapons are not under effective control, a glitch during the Obama administration where a single wing, 150 ICBMs through a technical glitch, were out of contact with command and control structures. You had cruise missiles that were flown across the country without the Air Force knowing that they'd actually flown live nuclear weapons. You have nuclear weapons that have fallen out of the sky. You have nuclear weapons that have fallen off the back of aircraft carriers. We believe that we are fully in control of these weapons, and in fact, we can't be, because we have thousands of people involved trying to manage thousands of weapons at dozens of sites, and it's a complicated, difficult thing. And this is not for lack of trying or lack of seriousness. We just have to recognize that there is risk baked into the system. And so from my argument, and I think the argument of people who support no first use, the goal is to make the risk of nuclear use less likely. It is the greatest risk we face. It's the reason the doomsday clock is as close to midnight as it has ever been. And people, not just myself, but including your mentor, Bill Perry, and other former military officials have said that the ICBM force is not necessary for deterrence. It is only effective for war fighting and damage limitation. And we could effectively maintain a strong deterrent capability and reassurance capability for ourselves and our allies without ICBMs. Initially, I don't think anybody's talking about simply eliminating these systems on day one, but the idea that we might demate a significant portion of them and then work with Russia to further reduce their reliance on nuclear weapons to a point where we could both take steps back from the nuclear brink and raise the threshold of nuclear use seemed to be pretty commonsensical to me. The question of whether or not that actually weakens deterrence is something that we are guessing at because currently we're in no form of strategic dialogue with Russia or our allies about this issue. The Trump administration, I think, can be considered widely guilty of strategic neglect by not pursuing strategic stability talks with Russia and in demeaning the value of our alliances and in not engage in a sustained, serious assessment about what our defense and deterrence commitments are and how best to achieve them.
So if I can interject for a moment, it strikes me that there's a potential challenge in your argument for demating and de-arming as a mode of making no first use credible, and your argument that has a lot of empirical support that we, the United States, has not historically been as adept at nuclear command and control and procedures as possible. If I review through significant crises, including significant crises with nuclear elements, one of the common themes is that mistakes that seem unfathomable in retrospect are made in these crises. Don't I introduce an additional risk of crisis instability by adding now this process that we're not as good as we think we are at of managing the command, control, and signaling associated with remating and rearming to an already fraught situation?
You bet. Nuclear weapons is a risky business, and I don't think anybody who's ever been involved in nuclear planning, nuclear operations would or should tell you anything differently. The question is, how do you reduce those risks effectively? This is not an argument for nuclear abolition. There are obviously tremendous risks associated with the international system if you're going to go very rapidly, and nobody's talking about unilaterally taking off U.S. nuclear capabilities. The question is, how do you reduce the risks that are in front of you? Could you introduce operational difficulties or challenges if you were demating and remating warheads? Sure, but we take warheads off of ICBMs all the time. We do it for surveillance, we do it for maintenance, we do it for all sorts of reasons. So we do have a lot of experience in how to manage this. The question of how you're going to communicate this and signal to Russia is one that, quite frankly, we are not as adept at because we've fallen out of the business of actually talking to Russia about strategic affairs. I was the senior director that drafted the proposal in 2016 for the United States and Russia to resume strategic stability talks. The Trump administration held one round of those talks in, I believe, April of 2017, and they haven't happened since. And since then, you've had the president make multiple threats to use nuclear weapons, most recently against Afghanistan.
Weren't they over last week? And wasn't that group over with Sullivan over last week in Moscow?
That was not a full interagency team. That was basically Andrea Thompson, Tim Morrison from the White House, and Deputy Secretary of State Sullivan. But the discussion was rather limited. And there's no indication that they actually were empowered by the president to talk about these issues. And I think if you have any doubts, the fact that Tim Morrison, known as one of the dark opponents of all arms control agreements, was involved, gives you a sense on where that was headed.
I mean, it's important that we highlight areas of agreement with each other.
Sure.
John, I totally agree that if the Russians are living up to New START, then it's a no-brainer for the United States to extend. That achieves a number of objectives. We get transparency into the Russian program. We bolster support among the Democrats on the Hill for nuclear modernization, because I believe there has to be an arms control piece to the modernization story as well. And we achieve a valuable contribution to U.S. security. INF, I think, is a different story. The Russians abjectly violated a central premise of the treaty. Your team under Obama and the Trump team tried to get them to reverse over a period of 4 to 6 years, and it never happened. And I can't begrudge the president the withdrawal from that treaty. But you're right. There has to be arms control. There has to be arms control. New START extension is prudent, but this is not no first use. We're talking about other things here. No first use, coupled with yours and Nina's approach to couple it with major restructuring of U.S. forces. And basically, you're talking about it unilaterally, essentially, because the Russians have no interest in anything along these lines. Absolutely no interest.
I don't disagree, John, and I appreciate you trying to highlight the areas of importance. We totally agree on New START. The reality is the United States makes unilateral changes to its force structure all the time. One of the benefits of New START is that we're not locked into sublimits, and the United States can shift warheads between submarines and ICBMs and bombers. We could maintain the same forces, 1,550 accountable nuclear weapons, under a no first use agreement where we made changes to the ICBM force. So I just the word unilateral as you're using it, I know you're not intending it as a critique or as an insult, but the United States makes unilateral changes.
It's not an insult, but it's a critique.
Yeah, but the United States makes lots of unilateral changes to its arsenal without even communicating them to the Russians. We do it when it's in our interest to do so, and I know we disagree on this, but it's in our interest to reduce the risk of nuclear use that comes with threatening first use.
So if I can transition to an issue that you raised, Dr. Harvey, about the utility of signaling in dealing with nuclear weapons. And it strikes me that obviously the context provided by the president this week of obliquely referring to the ability to unilaterally end a war in Afghanistan through implicitly the use of nuclear weapons raises that issue. And this administration has shown a greater appetite for adventurism than perhaps some others. But
is that what he said? Is that what they said?
He said he could end the war in Afghanistan in a week to 10 days, but it would take 10 million casualties, and he wasn't ready to do that. Implicitly, the only way we could do that would be through the use of nuclear weapons. So my question is, as we move into a generation of policymakers who lack the Cold War context of nuclear signaling, which, as you know, was developed into a fine art from Thomas Schelling through Herman Kahn through generations and generations of scholars and theorists, is there value to a no first use policy in mitigating or tamping down inadvertent signals that could be destabilizing, such as a statement like we saw this week?
I think it's unfortunate for the president to be referring to these kinds of things. That said, the president, and I've looked at this objectively because I didn't vote for the man, the president has been reasonably responsible in his statements about the U.S. nuclear arsenal. I'm going to say that in his State of the Union address 2 years ago, not last year, but the year before, he basically had the Obama approach. He said, wouldn't it be great if we could get rid of these things? Unfortunately, we can't. And we need to keep them, he said something, Obama said, we need to keep them safe, secure, and effective until we can get rid of them. And Trump said essentially the same thing in his State of the Union address. The second thing that he's done is he's continued on with the Obama modernization program. The nuclear posture review under Mr. Trump has been basically a minor evolution from what came out from Mr. Obama in 2010. It's a minor evolution based on the changed security environment in the 8 years since Mr. Obama conducted his nuclear posture review. And so I've welcomed the fact that Trump has not been more vocal in brandishing and throwing around the U.S. nuclear arsenal as Mr. Putin has done.
Your memory's more selective than mine. I remember the president threatening Kim Jong-un, my button is bigger than yours, in the Korean Peninsula, where most people think the possibility of a sudden crisis and war is larger than any place else other than South Asia. So I actually look at multiple instances where the president has been irresponsible in threatening the use of nuclear weapons against nuclear, non-nuclear weapon states without any realistic understanding of the consequences for how that affects our alliances and stability in the world.
I found that his statement at the UN year before last on North Korea was not as objectionable as you do, because I believe that every once in a while, the president should speak to this question. And the North Koreans, in their testing of nuclear weapons, and their ballistic missile flight tests and all of that, have been extraordinarily irresponsible. And look what's happened. These guys are best buds.
Nothing's
okay?
happened, John.
They're bros.
North Korea
okay?
just had pictures showing their brand new ballistic missile submarine, showing that the nuclear capabilities of North Korea have continued to expand despite the fact that they're best buds. I don't think you can just look only at the president when he reads off the teleprompter and say, oh, he's been responsible. You have to look at the full suite of his comments. And the fact is, he has reduced the threshold for nuclear use. He has cast tremendous questions about American credibility with our allies and our adversaries. And he has made it much more likely that a crisis will happen and that it could go nuclear, particularly by seeking low-yield, more usable nuclear weapons, as called for in his nuclear posture review. I'm a bit defensive here in the comparison between Obama and Trump because I think there's so little to unite the approaches of the two men. President Obama said that we have a moral responsibility to take the concrete steps that will lead the world to the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Donald Trump said, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could get rid of nuclear weapons? Magically, maybe it will happen, but he hasn't taken a single step to actually try to make it happen because he and his advisors believe that the United States should have the right to use nuclear weapons and to pursue any type of military capabilities that it deems necessary without looking at the implications for international security. They think it happens in a vacuum, and you and I know that nothing happens in a vacuum, that our adversaries get a vote, and that we're headed, at least in my opinion, in the wrong direction.
Let me jump in with another argument here. Dr. Harvey, you raised Eisenhower's new look and the transition to nuclear warfighting. And you're right that a portion of that came from concern about conventional inferiority. But it wasn't so much that we couldn't necessarily have achieved conventional parity as that to do so would be cripplingly expensive. And as we face adversaries who increasingly have developed anti-access and area denial capabilities that hold our conventional forces at risk at greater distance, my question for you, Mr. Wolfstall, is there an economic argument in favor of first use because the U.S. has so many competing priorities for our limited economic resources? Is there an argument that nuclear warfighting is the more responsible social choice in order to conserve those resources?
Wow. You don't often hear nuclear warfighting and responsible social choice in the same sentence. I'm going to give a hard no to that. The idea that the United States is going to achieve security for itself or its allies on the cheap is obviously just a non-starter. The reality is we have a $750 billion defense budget. We spend more than the next 9 countries combined on defense. We have a nuclear arsenal that is more than capable, according to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of deterring and defeating any nuclear-armed adversary and then some. We have more nuclear weapons than we need. And we're engaged in a $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization program over the next 30 years that will seek to replicate the same Cold War nuclear infrastructure that we felt it was necessary to hold off the Soviet Union when we were engaged in a global political and military competition. The reality is that we can deter, and this has been looked at by the Air Force and other parts of the U.S. military, we can deter at very low levels. We know that we don't need many nuclear weapons to convince any potential opponent, Putin, Xi, that the costs of starting a nuclear war are not worth it. Where our nuclear weapons arsenal has to increase is when it comes to reassuring our allies and when it comes to limiting the damage that could be done to the United States if deterrence were to fail. What we're talking about is, in part, taking damage limitation and warfighting out of the equation. In this case, it's because we don't want a nuclear war to start, because then we can play to our conventional advantage. And if you can do that, you can take a significant part of the $50 billion a year plus we're spending on nuclear weapons each year over the next 30 years and put it towards the things you actually need to focus on, like cyber defense and cyber offense. I wouldn't be spending all this money on nuclear weapons, on weapons that we could actually do away with a significant portion of in order to spend it on things we actually need. And one of the anecdotes that I tell a lot is at the end of the Obama administration, when we were talking about whether or not we could change the modernization program, the president said clearly, when a senior general told him, well, look, we can afford these things. He's like, don't give me that. You come in here every week begging for an extra $1 billion for ISR packages. Don't tell me these things are affordable. Everything has to compete with everything else. We should get rid of those things we don't need. And first use, in my opinion, is one of those things we don't need.
Doyle, let me respond to your question about possible benefits. misleading to say that the U.S. has a first-use nuclear policy. It's a shortcut, and it's a misleading shortcut. There is an extremely limited set of circumstances where the U.S. might consider the use of nuclear weapons, and we want to keep that both limited and make it even smaller. A very, very small subset of that set entails non-nuclear scenarios whereupon the U.S. might seek to deter, in part with nuclear weapons. And you need to understand what these scenarios are. They involve the types of attacks against the U.S. or its allies that are catastrophic, non-nuclear attacks that are so catastrophic they would bring about the same effects as a potential nuclear strike on the United States or its allies. If North Korea were to use its chemical weapons in an initial assault to try to forcefully reunite the peninsula, where it uses chemical weapons, it would kill hundreds of thousands of South Koreans and Americans. This is a major catastrophic attack on an ally. Would we want KJU to think that the U.S. would definitely not respond with nuclear weapons, or do we want to leave him the uncertainty that perhaps we would? And this gets to the point of use versus deterrence. I want those nuclear forces for deterrence. I may choose a completely different approach to address a North Korean chemical weapons attack on Seoul than nuclear weapons. I personally believe that we can deal with most North Korean conventional contingencies, even CW, with conventional U.S. forces. But I don't want to take that thing off the table. I want him to think that we just simply might use nuclear weapons to destroy his regime. And that to me is an element, that to me conveys an important element of deterrence that certainly the South Koreans value.
This is a very complicated issue, John, and you and I will talk about this over the beer that I'll buy next time. But I think this is a great example of my central point, which is 20, 30 years ago, when we looked at the North Korean contingencies and said, look, they might use chemical weapons, we need to be able to deter that, that was at a certain point in time. Today, North Korea can land a nuclear weapon on U.S. territory. And so in the fog of war, where a conventional conflict has started, and we are flying bombers over at the Korean Peninsula, and we have eroded their early warning network, and they don't know what's coming at them, the fact that we threaten the first use of nuclear weapons at times in response to chemical weapons may lead him prematurely to launch out of fear that he won't be able to do it later. It becomes a use it or lose it situation for him, lowering the nuclear threshold and increasing the risk that he will launch a nuclear weapon at the United States or at South Korea. When, I think you and I would agree, we don't have to, because we can defeat him conventionally. And I think that's the central point. The risk of first use threats are often ignored by the proponents, including, I think, you in this case. And the benefits of raising the nuclear threshold are dismissed. And I think we need to flip that on its head.
So we're coming up on the end of our allotted time, and what I would ask is if each of you would take 2 to 3 minutes just to sort of summarize your argument and respond to any points that you feel like we haven't collected in the discussion up to this point.
Sure. Well, there are two things I want to say other than just thank you. I think this has been a really useful discussion. One is, John and I have known each other for a long time. We are friends, and it's important for us in this environment to say, look, we want the exact same thing. Neither of us want nuclear weapons to ever be used again. We know how horrific these weapons are and what they can do. And what we're debating is the most effective way to do that and the most credible way to do that. And I think we need to do that in a very objective way, looking at the facts on the ground. We're obviously influenced by our own experience and our own perspectives on these issues, but we've got to continually revisit the evidence. And I've done that over the course of my career. I know that John does that. We just have ended up in very different places. But in that, there's one issue we didn't get to, and that's this question of proliferation. And by adopting no first use, will we lead our allies to reconsider their nuclear use? But who is it that's going to proliferate? What countries are we actually worried about? And when you talk about specifics, it's very hard to envision a country that would say, oh, the U.S. is still prepared to respond to nuclear use with its full nuclear arsenal. They just won't go first. Well, I better get my own nuclear weapon so I can go first. if you look at the question of whether South Korea, Japan, Germany, the Baltic states, we have tremendous influence over those countries. It would be tremendously detrimental to American security if those countries were to go nuclear. And we have the means at our disposal, cooperatively through conventional, other means of military, political, and economic cooperation, to reassure them that they don't need those capabilities, that we have their backs, without relying on the threat of first use. Because again, neither John nor I want these countries to go nuclear. But I think it's important to break it down into the specifics as opposed to saying, well, countries could go nuclear. Well, yeah, that's true. But they could go nuclear now by looking at Donald Trump and saying, well, that guy doesn't have our back. And where's the United States really going to be in 20 years? So it's not a question of what nuclear weapons we have. It's a question of what political commitment do we use to back up our alliances.
I want to touch on I want to reemphasize one point and bring a couple of new ideas in. And this has to do with a principal driver for no first use policy, and that is concern about the vulnerability of fixed silo-based ICBMs. The Cold War concern was that the Russians could launch an attack, a surprise attack, on our ICBM force and destroy them with good probability, and that in order for the U.S. to deter such an attack, we needed to have a capability to launch ICBMs rapidly so that when the Russian warheads arrived, the holes would be empty, or at least the Russian leadership would have to assume that that was a possible outcome. And this put us on a fairly fast response time frame to be able to get a decision from the president about responding. And his other option, of course, is to ride out the attack. And again, our policy, we've never had a policy to launch out under attack, but we've maintained the option to do so simply to keep that arrow in our quiver to make the Russians and anyone else who might seek to attack our ICBM force. Right now, only the Russians can do that from doing so. Mr. Obama was never comfortable with the idea that I'm going to have to make a decision in a few minutes on responding. And he asked us in the Department of Defense to come up with some approaches to increase decision time. And we came up with a few ideas. First of all, New START, in which U.S. ICBMs have gone from highly MIRV systems, the Peacekeeper, for example, which had 10 warheads on it, to each ICBM having a single warhead, makes them much less vulnerable targets, or much less valuable targets. 1 or 2 Russian RVs are required to destroy 1 U.S. RV, as opposed to back in the day when 1 or 2 Russian RVs could destroy 3 or 10 U.S. warheads. So the value of attacking these forces are lower. We've increased the relative proportion of our force in the SLBMs, which means that a smaller percentage of our ICBMs are at risk. And the third thing we've done is we've taken steps to try to increase warning time and modernizing of nuclear command and control systems to try to give the president the ability to detect a surprise attack early and get out of town, for example, so that a ride-out option is feasible. The last thing that makes a ride-out option feasible is the fact that whether the Russians were able to destroy U.S. ICBMs, there are several hundred warheads at sea that on submarines that are going to survive and that would subject the Russians to an extraordinarily damaging retaliatory strike. So there's a lot of things on the board now that weren't there during the Cold War that reduce the likelihood that the president would have to make a rapid launch. And this reduces the value to to those who think that no first use would provide benefit.
Well, this has been an extremely consequential and enjoyable discussion. I don't think we're likely to come to agreement among all the parties, but I would encourage our listeners, if you haven't done so already, to read the full essays by Mr. Wolfstahl and Dr. Harvey, along with Dr. Nina Tannenwald, and 2 really interesting and enlightening essays by Brendan Green and Rachel Whitlark that deal with the question of single-point sole authority command and control over nuclear weapons. That can be found on our website, tnsr.org. Thank you again to Mr. Wolfstahl and Dr. Harvey, and thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Doyle, thanks very much. Trey, also, John, it's fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.